Hello everyone. Welcome to Lessons from Life. Every Monday morning, I found flowers outside my front door. Not expensive flowers, not bouquets from a florist, just small, carefully arranged bunches of wildflowers. Sometimes daisies, sometimes lavender, sometimes tiny yellow flowers I couldn't even name. There was never a note, never a name, and for almost 6 months, I had absolutely no idea who was leaving them. At first, I thought it was romantic. Then, I thought it was strange. Eventually, I discovered it was something much more beautiful. My name is Daniel, and this is the story of the woman who taught me that kindness doesn't always need an explanation. 6 years ago, I moved into a small apartment building on the edge of town. I had just lost my job. My relationship had ended, and my savings were disappearing faster than I wanted to admit. I was 32 years old and completely lost. Every morning, I searched for work. Every afternoon, I sent application. Every evening, I returned to my quiet apartment and wondered how my life had become so different from what I had imagined. I stopped calling friends. I stopped going out. I even stopped answering messages. I didn't want anyone to know I was struggling. One Monday morning, I opened my door and saw a small bunch of daisies sitting on the floor. I looked around the hallway. Nobody was there. I picked them up. They were fresh, still covered in tiny drops of water. I assumed someone had accidentally left them there. So I put them in a glass beside my kitchen window. The next Monday there were more. This time, lavender. I stood in the hallway for several minutes. Who was doing this? I asked my neighbors. Nobody knew. I asked the building manager. He laughed. Maybe you have a secret admirer. I smiled, but I knew it wasn't that. There was something different about the flowers. They weren't arranged professionally. The stems were uneven. The flowers were simple. Some even had tiny leaves attached. It felt like someone had picked them from their own garden. For the next few weeks, the flowers continued. Every Monday, always before 8 a.m. Never a note, never a message, just flowers. And strangely, they started changing my mornings. I began waking up early on Mondays. I started wondering what flowers would be waiting. I found myself smiling before I even opened the door. For the first time in months, I had something small to look forward to. One Monday, there were no flowers. I was surprised by how disappointed I felt. I opened my door 3 times. Nothing. I went to work interviews that day feeling strangely empty. That evening, I returned home. Still nothing. The next Monday, nothing again. I realized I had become attached to something I didn't understand, and somehow, I missed the person behind it. Then one rainy Thursday evening, I saw an elderly woman standing outside the building. She was holding a basket full of flowers. I recognized her immediately. She lived across the street. I'd seen her many times, walking slowly through the neighborhood. She was probably in her 70s. She looked at me, then smiled. "Daniel?" I froze. "Yes?" She pointed toward my apartment. "I suppose you finally figured it out." I couldn't believe it. "You've been leaving the flowers?" She nodded. "Why?" She smiled. "Because you needed them." I laughed nervously. "How did you know?" She looked at me for a moment. "Because I used to need them too." Her name was Margaret. She invited me to sit on her porch. Rain tapped softly against the roof. She told me that several years earlier, her husband had died. After 43 years of marriage, she said the house became unbearably quiet. She stopped cooking, stopped gardening, stopped talking to neighbors. One morning, a little girl from the neighborhood knocked on her door. The girl was holding 3 flowers. She said, "My mom says you look sad." Margaret laughed when she told me the story. That little girl had no idea what those flowers meant to me. The next morning, Margaret planted flowers again. Then she started giving them away, to people who looked lonely, to nurses, to teachers, to elderly neighbors, to anyone who seemed like they needed a little kindness. She never asked for anything in return. Why? I asked. She looked at the flowers in her basket. Because someone once gave me 3 flowers when I had nothing. She paused. Kindness should keep moving. I thought about that sentence for a long time. Kindness should keep moving. I told Margaret about losing my job, about my breakup, about how ashamed I felt. She listened. She didn't tell me everything would magically get better. She didn't give me empty motivational advice. She simply said, "You're having a difficult chapter. That doesn't mean it's the end of your story." Those words stayed with me. The next morning, I woke up early. I put on my best shirt. I printed another copy of my resume, and I went to another interview. I didn't get the job, but for the first time, I didn't feel defeated. I went home and applied for 3 more. The following week, I applied for 5, then 10. Slowly, things began changing. I found temporary work at a small bookstore. The pay wasn't great, but I enjoyed it. I met people. I talked again. I started reading. I started laughing. And every Monday, Margaret continued leaving flowers outside my door. But now, I started leaving something outside hers too. Sometimes fresh bread. Sometimes a cup of coffee. Sometimes a handwritten note. Neither of us mentioned it. We simply understood. Months passed. My life began improving. I eventually became manager of the bookstore. I rented a slightly larger apartment. I started exercising. I called old friends. I even began volunteering at a local community center. And I noticed something strange. The more kindness I gave away, the less lonely I felt. One winter morning, I knocked on Margaret's door. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I became worried. I called the emergency number. She had fallen in her kitchen. She was taken to the hospital. Thankfully, she was going to be okay. But the doctor told me she needed someone to help her for a while. I didn't hesitate. I'll help. For the next several months, I became the person who checked on Margaret. I bought her groceries. I cleaned her garden. I drove her to appointments. And every Sunday, we had lunch together. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we sat quietly. Neither of us needed to fill the silence. We had become family. One spring morning, Margaret gave me a small wooden box. "I want you to have this." Inside were dozens of dried flowers. Each one had a tiny date written beside it. I looked confused. "What are these?" She smiled. "Every flower I left at your door." I stared at the box. She had saved them all. Even the tiny ones. Even the imperfect ones. Why? Because you once thought they were just flowers. She touched my hand. They weren't. I began crying. Margaret smiled. "Those flowers were proof that someone noticed you. Sometimes that's all people need. To be noticed. To be remembered. To know that someone cares." Years have passed since then. Margaret is no longer with us. She passed away peacefully one summer morning. She was surrounded by friends, neighbors, and people whose lives she had touched. At her funeral, I brought flowers. Not expensive ones, just simple wildflowers. Daisies, lavender, and tiny yellow flowers. The same kind she used to leave at my door. Today, I run a small community garden. Every Monday morning, I pick flowers. Then I leave them outside random doors around my neighborhood. No names, no notes, no explanation. Just flowers. Sometimes I leave them for an elderly person. Sometimes for a single parent. Sometimes for someone I know is having a difficult time. And sometimes I leave them outside a stranger's door. Because I know what one small act of kindness can do. A few months ago, I found a little envelope beside my own front door. Inside was a handwritten note. It said, "Thank you for the flowers." There was no name. I smiled. Then I realized something. Margaret's kindness had finally come full circle. She had started something that would continue long after she was gone. I've learned that we often underestimate small acts. A flower, a smile, a phone call, a cup of coffee, a simple, "Are you okay?" We think we need to do something extraordinary to change someone's life. We don't. Sometimes, we just need to notice. If you're listening to this and you're going through a difficult time, please remember something. Your current situation is not your final destination. A bad chapter isn't the whole story. And if you're doing okay, look around. Someone near you may be struggling silently. You don't need to fix their life. You don't need perfect words. Just let them know. They aren't invisible. Because Margaret taught me something I'll carry for the rest of my life. Kindness doesn't have to be big to be powerful. Sometimes, it's just a handful of flowers left quietly at someone's door. And sometimes, those flowers are enough to remind a lonely person that tomorrow is still worth opening the door for. Thank you for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe this channel to see more heart-touching story. See you in the next video.